I'm Teresa. I'm 39. And when I woke up from a 6-month coma, my bakery wasn't mine. My mother had signed documents I didn't remember. My brother was running the bank accounts. My husband, the man who drove me to the hospital the night of the accident, had sold my sourdough starter recipe to a national chain for $400,000. They told me I was confused by the medication, that I'd agreed to transfer the business before the accident, that I'd suggested my brother take control temporarily. But I found the video. The security camera in the bakery kitchen, which my mother forgot to deactivate. It showed me, unconscious in a wheelchair, being pushed by my husband into a notary's office. My head hung loose. My hand, held in his, signed documents I couldn't read. And when I showed it at my parents' anniversary dinner, the first time they'd seen my 7-year-old daughter since I woke up, my mother said, "We did what was best for the family business, Teresa. You chose to be alone in this." So I showed them what I chose to do alone, starting with the recipe none of them could steal, because the real recipe was in my head, and in my daughter's. I built El Horno de Teresa from a market stall. 15 years ago, I was 24, newly married, with a baby on the way and a sourdough starter my grandmother had kept alive for 60 years. I started at the municipal market, selling conchas and bolillos from a folding table, waking at 3 a.m. to mix dough in my apartment kitchen, carrying everything in plastic bins on the bus. By the time I was 30, I had a storefront. By 35, 12 employees. By 38, annual sales of $2 million and a line out the door every Saturday morning. The recipe was never written down completely. My grandmother taught me that way, and her grandmother before her. "The dough speaks," she'd say, pressing my young hands into the wet mass. "You just have to listen." I listened. For 30 years, I listened. The humidity of the day, the temperature of the kitchen, the particular rhythm of fermentation that changed with the seasons. I could feel when the starter was ready, when the gluten had developed enough, when the crust would crack just right. I never measured with precision. I measured with my hands, my nose, my memory. My mother, Carmen, never understood. She was a housewife her entire life, married to my father at 19, dependent on his income, his decisions, his presence. When he died 5 years ago, she was lost in a way that looked like resentment. She resented my independence, my business, my refusal to need a man. "You're too alone in this," she'd say, watching me knead dough at family dinners. "A business needs family, family shares." My brother Roberto understood even less. He was 42, a serial entrepreneur whose ventures failed with predictable regularity: a car wash, a food truck, a real estate scheme, a cryptocurrency investment that lost everything. Each time, my mother bailed him out. Each time, he promised it was different. Each time, he came to me for advice, which meant money, which I never gave. "You're selfish with that recipe," he said once, drunk at Christmas. "You could franchise, you could make us all rich, but you hoard it like it's gold." My husband, Miguel, was the closest to understanding. He was a chef, or had been, before his own restaurant failed. He came to work with me as a favor, managing the kitchen while I handled the business. But he never contributed anything original. He wanted to industrialize, to standardize, to replace my grandmother's methods with premixes and timers and temperature-controlled proofing boxes. "You're a craftsman, Teresa," he'd say. "I'm a businessman, we need both." We didn't need both, we needed me. I discovered him in bed with our accountant 3 years before the accident. We separated but never divorced. The business was too complex, too demanding, too much mind to bother with legal formalities. Sophia was my reason. My daughter, born the year I opened the market stall, raised in the bakery's back room, sleeping in a drawer while I shaped dough at 4 a.m. She was 7 when the accident happened, old enough to stand on a stool and mix her first batch of masa, old enough to listen to the dough with me on Saturday mornings. "It sounds like waves," she said once, her small ear pressed against the proofing bowl. I cried. She was right. She was always right. The accident was a Tuesday in December. I closed the bakery at 11 p.m., the last batch of tomorrow's bolillos shaped and resting. Miguel offered to drive me home, unusual but not suspicious. We'd maintained a civil relationship for Sophia's sake. At the intersection of Reforma and Juarez, a truck ran a red light. I remember the headlights, the sound of Miguel screaming, the sensation of flying. Then nothing. 6 months of coma. 6 months of dreams where I was still kneading dough, still listening to the starter bubble, still teaching Sophia the feel of properly developed gluten. 6 months of my body healing while my life was dismantled. Miguel obtained emergency power of attorney as my legal husband. My mother supported this. My brother managed the temporary operations. Together, they transferred the bakery's ownership to a family corporation. Teresa 20%, Miguel 40%, Carmen 20%, Roberto 20%. They sold my sourdough recipe to Pan National, a supermarket chain, for $400,000 split 3 ways with nothing to me. They fired 8 of my 12 original employees, replacing them with teenagers who didn't know the difference between artisanal and industrial. They changed the name to El Horno Familiar. They destroyed everything I'd built and called it improvement. I woke up confused. Amnesia, the doctors said, partial, selective, unpredictable. I remembered Sophia. I remembered my grandmother's hands. I remembered the smell of proofing dough, the particular sour tang of a healthy starter. But I couldn't remember the accident, the months before, the documents I'd supposedly signed. Miguel visited, concerned, bringing papers. You discussed these before the accident, he said. You wanted to protect the business in case something happened. You suggested Roberto take over temporarily. I signed some. My hand moved automatically, trained by years of contracts and permits and tax forms. But something didn't fit. My hands remembered kneading. My nose remembered yeast. My heart remembered that the bakery was mine, only mine, built from nothing by my hands and my grandmother's recipe. Lupe saved me. She'd been my first employee 15 years ago, a widow with 3 children who needed the work. I'd taught her everything, promoted her to head baker, trusted her with the kitchen when I couldn't be there. She visited me in rehabilitation, bringing not flowers but a USB drive. The kitchen camera, she said. You installed it yourself, remember, to protect the recipe. Your mother forgot it existed when she changed the locks. I didn't remember installing it, but I recognized the footage. Myself in a wheelchair, head lolling, eyes closed or half open in a drugged stupor. Miguel pushing me through the bakery's back door, into his car, into a notary's office across town. Carmen walking beside us, smiling, chatting with the notary as if this were a normal business transaction. Roberto waiting outside, checking his phone, looking up only when we emerged. The date stamp, 3 weeks after the accident. Medical records showed me in coma, unresponsive in the hospital. But there I was, signing documents with my hand held in Miguel's grip, my signature a wobbly parody of itself, my consciousness somewhere far from that room. I watched it 100 times. Each viewing added a new detail. The notary's discomfort, visible only in the way she avoided looking at my face. The way Carmen patted my shoulder, the same gesture she'd used when I was a child, and she was dismissing my concerns. The way Miguel's thumb pressed over mine, guiding the pen, forcing the signature that gave away my life. I started investigating. Slowly, carefully, hiding my progress from the family that still visited, still concerned, still lied. I found that Miguel had used the $400,000 to buy a restaurant with his lover, the accountant. I found that Carmen had paid Roberto's mortgage with bakery funds. I found that El Horno Familiar was technically bankrupt. The industrial premixes didn't work. The customers had left. The brand was poisoned, but I found something else. Sophia, my daughter, had been visiting the original bakery in secret, with Lupe, learning, kneading. Before the accident, I'd taught her on Saturday mornings, showing her the recipe not on paper but in practice. The dough speaks, I'd told her. You just have to listen. She'd listened, she'd learned. She had the recipe in her small hands, her young memory, her love that didn't need documents. I found her one Saturday, in the market where I'd started, in a borrowed corner of Lupe's cousin's stall. She was 8 now, taller, her hands dusted with flour, shaping conchas with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years. She looked up and saw me, and her face broke into a smile that made the 6 months of coma worth every nightmare. Mama, she said, I've been practicing. Lupe says I'm almost as good as you. I held her floury hands. I pressed them to my face. I cried, and the tears mixed with the flour, and we laughed, and in that moment I knew what I had to do. The confrontation was at my parents' 40th anniversary. Carmen had organized it, a celebration of a marriage that had produced her dependency and my father's early death. She'd chosen Miguel's restaurant, the one bought with my stolen recipe, as the venue. She'd invited the extended family, the neighbors, the church friends who'd watched me grow and now watched me fall. She hadn't invited me. I appeared anyway, with Sophia, with Lupe, with 4 of my fired employees, with a projector that someone I never said who had installed in the private dining room. The video played during dessert. Carmen was cutting the cake, the same ritual she'd performed at every family celebration, the center of attention she demanded. the lights dimmed. The screen lit up. And there I was, unconscious, puppeted, robbed in broad daylight by the people who claimed to love me. The silence was absolute. Miguel stood, knocking over his chair, rushing to stop the projection. Roberto shouted montage, his voice cracking with the desperation of someone who'd used that excuse before. Carmen stood frozen, the cake knife in her hand, her face a mask of shock that was almost convincing. I walked to the front of the room. I took the knife from my mother's hand. I set it down on the cake, which was industrial, tasteless, bought from a supplier rather than baked with love. You wanted the recipe, I said, my voice was steady, it was the steadiest it had ever been. You wanted to share, you wanted family, you wanted what I'd built alone because you couldn't build anything yourselves. I turned to Miguel. You sold my grandmother's starter to a chain that uses preservatives. You bought this restaurant with blood money. You thought you understood business. You understood theft. I turned to Roberto. You took mortgage payments from the bakery account. You hired teenagers who couldn't tell yeast from baking powder. You thought you were an entrepreneur. You were a parasite. I turned to Carmen. You smiled while I signed away my life. You patted my shoulder while I was drugged. You told me I was alone and then you proved it by taking everything I had. Carmen found her voice. We did what was best for the family business, she said. The same words, the same justification, the same complete absence of responsibility. You chose to be alone in this. You always were selfish with that recipe. You never wanted to share. I smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally, completely understood who she was dealing with. You were right, I said. The recipe was mine, and I never shared it with you, but I shared it with someone else. I brought Sophia forward, my daughter, 8 years old, flour still dusting her hair from that morning's practice. She stood before the assembled family, before the neighbors who'd whispered about my confusion, before the church friends who'd prayed for my recovery while my mother spent their offerings. I know how to make the dough, Sophia said. Her voice was small but clear, the voice of a child who had learned from watching, from doing, from listening. Mama taught me, I don't need paper. The dough speaks to me. She held up her hands, small, flour-dusted, already developing the calluses of a baker. These are my hands, she said. This is my recipe and you can't have it. I didn't sue for the bakery. It no longer existed as I'd known it. El Horno Familiar was a corpse, kept animate by debt and desperation, waiting for the final collapse. I let it fall. I let them fall with it. Instead, I opened El Horno de Sofia, a stall in the municipal market, where I'd started 15 years ago. Lupe came, and 3 of the original employees. We used the real recipe, the one only Sophia and I knew. We didn't write it down. We didn't patent it. We protected it the only way that worked. Mother to daughter, hand to hand, heart to heart. Miguel lost the restaurant. The accountant left him when the story went public, when Pan National sued for misrepresentation of the recipe, when the industrial premixes failed to replicate what my hands and Sophia's could create. He tried to open another restaurant, using his own recipes, his own methods. It closed in 3 months. He moved to another city, another state, eventually another country. I heard he was washing dishes in Madrid. I didn't verify. I didn't care. Roberto lost the house. The mortgage payments from the bakery were fraudulent, the bank discovered eventually, and the collateral was seized. He moved in with Carmen, 2 failures sharing a shrinking space, 2 resentments feeding each other. He tried another business, another scheme, another desperate reach. It failed as they always failed. He was 45, living with his mother, unemployed, unloved by anyone who wasn't obligated. Carmen lost the anniversary dinner. She lost more than that. She lost the respect of neighbors who'd watched the video, who'd seen her smile while her daughter was robbed, who'd heard her justification and recognized it as the lie it was. She still lived in the same house, still attended the same church, still sat in the same pew. But people moved away from her. They didn't confront, they simply didn't engage. She became invisible, the worst punishment for someone who demanded attention her entire life. But I didn't seek their destruction. I sought their irrelevance. El Horno de Sofia grew, not to $2 million, to something more valuable, community. The original employees became partners, each with a share, each with a voice. The customers came for the taste, not the price. They came for the conchas that cracked just right, for the bolillos that smelled of memory, for the Saturday mornings when Sophia and I worked side by side, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. Sophia taught other children. The recipe expanded, not through sale but through teaching. Each child who learned received a unique variation, adapted to their hands, their climate, their story. The recipe became legion, uncontrollable, unstealable. It lived in 100 kitchens, 1,000 hands, a million memories. At 15, Sophia was head baker in all but name. She taught classes, managed the stall, negotiated with suppliers. She was me, but better, more confident, more generous, more willing to share what I'd hoarded. The recipe wants to travel, she told me once. Grandma's starter wanted to live, that's why she taught you, that's why you taught me, that's why we teach them. Carmen came to the market once. She was old now, alone, her resentment calcified into something that looked like arthritis of the soul. She stood in line, anonymous in the crowd, waiting for Concha. Sophia served her. She didn't recognize her grandmother or pretended not to. She simply handed her the bread, warm from the oven, dusted with sugar, smelling of everything that had been stolen and rebuilt. Carmen bit into it. She cried. Not the performative tears of the anniversary dinner, but something real, something painful, something that recognized what she'd destroyed. It tastes like your grandmother, she said to me, though I was behind the counter, though she couldn't see me. Sophia answered. It tastes like my mother and me and everyone who has learned with us. You were never in this recipe. Carmen left. She didn't return. She died 2 years later alone, her death discovered by a neighbor who noticed the mail piling up. I attended the funeral. I stood at the back, silent, present. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My presence was enough, the final proof that she'd failed to destroy me, that I'd outlasted her, that the recipe and the life she'd tried to steal had survived and multiplied beyond her comprehension. Roberto came to me after the funeral. He was 50, broken, desperate. He wanted to learn. He wanted to work at the stall. He wanted to be part of what I'd built, the way he'd wanted to be part of what I'd built before, but without the theft this time. I said no, not with hatred, with honesty. You don't want to learn, I said. You want to attach yourself to something successful. That's what you've always wanted. That's why you failed. You never wanted to build, you wanted to inherit. He left. I didn't see him again. I heard he moved to another city, found work in a factory, lived alone. I didn't verify. I didn't care. Miguel died in Madrid, liver failure, the kind that comes from drinking away failure. I learned through a letter from his sister who'd found my address in his effects. She asked if I wanted his ashes. I said no. I said Sophia and I had already built everything he couldn't take. The recipe is still unwritten. Sophia knows it completely now. She teaches her own daughter, a fierce 3-year-old who stands on a stool and presses her ear to the proofing bowl, listening for the waves. It speaks, the child says, and Sophia smiles, and I watch from my chair in the corner, too old to knead for long, young enough to recognize the continuation of something that began before me and will continue after. If someone stole what you built with your hands, hear me. They didn't steal your skill. They didn't steal your knowledge. They didn't steal the thing that lives in your muscle memory, your senses, your love. They stole the container, the shell, the name on the door. What you are, what you can create, what you can teach, that remains. That multiplies. That becomes stronger when shared than when hoarded. I built a bakery from a market stall. My family stole it while I was in a coma. I built another, with my daughter, with my community, with the recipe that traveled through hands and hearts rather than documents and signatures. The first bakery was worth $2 million. The second is worth more than I can measure, because it can't be stolen, because it was never mine alone, because it belongs to everyone who learned, who taught, who listened to the dough speak. That's my story. If it spoke to you, comment below. If someone stole what you built, tell me. I'll read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.